An interesting concept in alternate history is that of a unified lowlands, usually focused on the Kingdom of the Netherlands as created after Napoleon's defeat. Yet, as you might know, this unification ended up being a disaster, as the Belgians revolted against the Dutch and Limburg and Luxembourg were only recovered due to great power pressure. While preventing this revolution wouldn't be impossible, it would require significant changes to Dutch and Belgian interactions. Fact is, by 1815, the region had been divided for about 250 years, and during this time, they had grown further and further apart. The North had become Protestant and was focused heavily on being a trade economy. The South remained Catholic, and their economy was more traditionally based on industry, specifically the cloth trade. Even the unifying aspect of language wasn't universal, as the southern half of Belgium spoke French. These things swiftly started causing issues. While the Dutch Republic was tolerant for its time, the Catholics were still second-rate citizens at best and repressed at worst. When this republic then made way for a kingdom in 1815, near absolute power came to lie with a Protestant Dutch king, who consistently prioritized Dutch interests over Belgian concerns. Belgium at this time was remarkably industrialized for its size, by 1830 matching the industrialization of the great power of Prussia, and consuming twice as much coal as the entire USA. So the Dutch came up with a genius scheme: build canals connecting the industrial south to the trade hubs in the north, so the trade-focused Dutch can sell them abroad for a profit. On paper, a decent plan. But of course, most of the money ended up with the Dutch traders, not the Belgian workers. These economic, religious and political tensions ended up underpinning the fundamental mismatch of the two regions. And the Belgians, who actually made up the majority of the population, decided that enough was enough and they broke away. So considering the issues that came from 1815, today I'd like to discuss an underrated alternative. Why don't we unify much of the region far earlier, during the Dutch War for Independence? When talking about this conflict, we often mark a clear split between the Protestants revolting against Spain and the Catholics in the south remaining loyal. But it was more complicated than that. In an early stage of the revolution, the entire Low Countries, except Luxembourg, united against Spanish abuses in the Union of Brussels. Yet, by this point, their demands were mostly increased autonomy, rather than fighting for the formation of a unified independent state. As such, the centers of Dutch Protestantism, Holland and Zeeland, were initially excluded from this attempted autonomous union, until William of Orange, today the father of the Netherlands, personally convinced the Union to let them participate too, arguing for religious tolerance and equality for Protestants. This would further complicate the conflict, as King Philip II had initially supported the Union of Brussels' attempt at restoring peace. But now, Protestants were feeling emboldened. In several major cities across Flanders, Protestants cooed major cities, which began to spook the Catholic South. Philip, of course, opposed these developments, and the Catholic, French-speaking southern provinces voluntarily rejoined Spain, along with some dispersed territories in the north. Importantly, the Spanish then successfully pushed the Dutch back significantly, and the Protestant and Jewish populations of Flanders either fled or were expelled by the Spanish, setting up for the stark Protestant-Catholic divide between the northern Netherlands and Flanders, which hadn't yet existed at the start. For about 60 more years, the conflict would continue, both sides holding out for either a total victory or at the very least a more advantageous front line. But in practice, the war mostly stabilized, and we get the vague shape of the Mother Netherlands, with the Flemish ending up on their own path within what would later become Belgium. But what if all of this changed? What if the Dutch were successful in roughly holding their initial boundaries of revolt, before the Spanish managed to reclaim most of the south? What if from the very start of the Netherlands, what are today the Dutch-speaking regions of Belgium, were united with their northern brothers? The precise military aspects of the scenario I don't really care too much about. Let's just say the Spanish army is more incompetent and the Dutch-Flemish forces mostly hold off the Spanish in the south. What effect might this have on Europe going forward? For one, the war might be over sooner, as Spain has less reason to continue this war for 80 years in total. But most notably, how might this rather expanded Netherlands be changed compared to our own timeline? To start, let's focus on the internal workings of the Dutch, which during this time were actually rather fascinating. During an era of monarchies across Europe, the Dutch were pioneering a republican system, in which the 7 provinces each sent representatives to the Estates General. There were also some territories during the Independence War and were still Catholic. As such, these territories didn't get self-rule and were governed by the 7 provinces. Drenthe did get some self-rule, but no representation on the confederal level. These southern Catholic territories would then be exploited for profit by the Protestant North for centuries. Now, in many aspects, the 7 provinces were autonomous, except they sent representatives to The Hague, where the confederal government controlled foreign policy, naval and military policy, as well as governing previously mentioned territories and later colonial matters. In theory, the 7 provinces were about equal, but in practice, the province of Holland was by far the most dominant province, controlling the most lucrative ports, trading networks and population centers, and providing by far most of the confederal budget. Most of the political power within the Republic was held in 2 positions: the stadhouder and the raadspensionaris, the stadholder and the grand pensionary. Each province got to choose their own stadholder, who controlled that province's military. In practice usually, but not always, all or most provinces chose the same member of the family of Orange, the family of William of Orange, who had led the revolution. The grand pensionary, meanwhile, is most easily, but wrongly, oversimplified as a prime minister. Importantly, they led the delegation of Holland at the confederal level. Because Holland was so singularly influential within the Republic, this quickly evolved into the most powerful civil position, generally directing the confederal government at large and being in charge of direct communications of the Republic. This is also partially why so many foreign nations refer to the Netherlands as Holland. Not only was it the most important province, did they have the most influential foreign traders and ports, but if you sent communications to the Dutch Republic, you'd address them to the Grand Pensionary of Holland. Now, why do I tell you all this? Well, because the addition of the provinces of Flanders and Brabant are going to radically change everything I just said. Having fought with the revolution from the start, they cannot just be reduced to territories. Besides, as we will soon explore, they are way too populous to even attempt such a thing. As such, these 2 provinces will hold a lot of power on the confederal level, greatly reducing the dominance of Holland, with both the southern provinces having significantly higher populations. In 1500, Holland had 275,000, Brabant 400,000, and Flanders 750,000. Historically, this shifted a bit during and after the Independence Wars. Holland benefited most from the Spanish reconquest of Flanders, as the wealthy Protestant and Jewish traders and craftsmen of the region moved to cities like Amsterdam in Holland, starting a positive feedback loop where Holland grew wealthier and more people settled to grow its cities. Crucially, the traditionally dominant port city of Antwerp was conquered and plundered several times during this war, obviously doing damage to the city, but also during the war, the Dutch gained control over the Schelde waterway leading to the city, thereby cutting off their port and allowing Amsterdam to become the trading capital of the Netherlands and the world. In this timeline, these things don't occur, and while some fighting still takes place in Flanders and Brabant, increasing the importance of the relatively safe Holland, I doubt it would be enough to overtake the massive edge held by the southern provinces. If anyone, Flanders would be the one to dominate the Republic, but more realistically, power is simply shared more equally amongst the big three. Now, perhaps surprisingly, there is at least a chance that this could hurt the Dutch in the long term. Why? Well, first, because Flanders and Brabant traditionally focused on industry, meaning the Dutch Republic doesn't hyper-specialize in trade as much as they did historically. Beyond that, Holland is very protected by several river lines, meaning the Dutch Republic didn't need that much of an army and spent most of their budget on the world's most powerful navy, as that was essentially all they needed. Flanders and Brabant just don't have such natural defenses, and since they would be on the front line of any potential war with either Spain or France, they will push for a much larger confederal army. In essence, the addition of Flanders and Brabant forced the Dutch to become far more of a traditional great power compared to what we saw in our own timeline. And in such a traditional game of power, I am not sure the Dutch can stand out in the same way. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So, with the internal Dutch situation covered, let's look outwards. How do international geopolitics butterfly due to what we have done here? Well, first, what might happen to the rest of the Spanish Netherlands? Honestly, they seem pretty doomed. Most of the actually wealthy areas have been stripped away, and by losing all of their port connections, any soldier to the region will have to travel the entire length of the Holy Roman Empire, which was a very expensive ordeal. So much so that the Spanish still have a saying, to put a pike in Flanders, meaning doing something really costly in terms of time and money. Considering this alternate war would be even more costly, with less odds of success and less important territories to defend, there is a good chance the war ends sooner than in our timeline. Not necessarily because of a full Dutch victory, but simply because the Spanish give up and recognize Dutch independence. What remains of the Spanish Low Countries would then be seen as little more than a territory which France and the Netherlands can compete over. In this light, it is likely Spain doesn't actually remain the biggest rival to the Dutch for long, as in the long term, the threat of France moving in on their southern border would be substantial. The French may very well swiftly become the biggest threat to Dutch power. Funnily enough, assuming there isn't an opportunity for the Dutch to conquer the south, the Dutch could even help defend the Spanish possessions, just to prevent the French from getting them instead. Now, France in general is in an interesting position, and may benefit immensely from the new situation on their northern border. In fact, let's go on a small tangent and discuss a truly terrifying potential of this alternate history: a Franco-Dutch personal union. This may sound crazy, and arguably it is, but this was something seriously proposed historically. After all, just not having a monarch was very uncomfortable during this time, and before settling on their republic, the Dutch had sought themselves a new monarch after having deposed Philip II. Along with gaining a new monarch for political purposes, who would respect the autonomy and religious freedoms of the Dutch provinces, it was also hoped that this monarch could help secure foreign aid. Two primary options were proposed: Elizabeth I of England and Henry III of France. Yet, neither option actually ended up manifesting historically. On paper, this seems stupid, especially with the knowledge of how powerful the Dutch Republic would become and how much they would combat both of these powers during the early modern era. But in the minds of these rulers, they were offered overlordship over an unruly bunch of estates, who would not accept royal absolutism, as the entire reason for this war was defending their autonomy. Both states were also busy with their own religious conflicts. Elizabeth was working to re-establish Protestantism in England, while defending against Spanish efforts to conquer her nation. France meanwhile was in a large-scale religious civil war. For both, accepting overlordship over this rebellious Protestant territory, while tempting, presented huge problems. Henry III himself was Catholic, so would lose his domestic base of support if he had accepted. Then there was also the matter that accepting would mean committing to a long and drawn-out war with Spain, which they had no appetite for at the moment. Of course, in this alternate timeline, it is very possible that with the war not being quite as difficult for the Dutch, such offers are not actually even made, as they are more comfortable in their own abilities, not requiring foreign assistance to win. But if such offers are made, it would become more plausible that these monarchs could be interested. With Flanders and Brabant included, the price would be far greater, the nation they stand to inherit far wealthier, while historically, the Dutch Republic got most of their wealth long after these proposals were made. Beyond that, if the Dutch asked for assistance, it would seem far easier to join in and swiftly and decisively end the conflict. So, while I won't go into detail on the prospect, the concept of a Franco-Dutch or Anglo-Dutch personal union would not be crazy in this timeline. And of course, either of these outcomes could mean a massive boost to the nation that accepts. But even without such radical changes, France stands to benefit substantially. For basically the entire 1600s, most of their effort was spent on gaining as much of the Spanish lowlands as possible. In this timeline, the French may very well be significantly more successful, and halfway through the century could have already largely eliminated the Spanish presence in the north. If so, the Franco-Dutch relationship could very well direct the future of Europe. Do the two powers come to oppose each other as France eyes up the rest of the southern lowlands, or do France and the Dutch remain cordial? Either scenario is absolutely plausible. For France, there would be a lot of value in conquering the southern lowlands, but also having a secure northern border could be rather appealing. For the Dutch, building a buffer zone against the French is nice, but if the two sides are friendly, such a buffer is largely unnecessary. This may well become a crucial point in this alternate timeline. One of the factors in how the Dutch managed to become so dominant over global trade in this era is by radically and recklessly underfunding their army. This would lead to a disaster historically, as France allied itself with England and some German princes to invade the Dutch. The attacking nations were primarily driven by jealousy about Dutch economic hegemony, and due to the invasion, which the Dutch army was hopelessly underprepared for, the Dutch Golden Age would end, and while they didn't lose that much territory, the Dutch would never again truly be able to call themselves a European great power. In this alternate timeline, the Dutch Republic with their French border doesn't have the luxury to not have a well-maintained army. Again, even without an army, Holland was defended by the Dutch waterways, Flanders and Brabant were not, and in any such war would have to rely on simple traditional warfare to keep themselves safe. Investments into the military and national defense mean that the Dutch cannot pretend to be an island nation, and this means that first Portugal and later England and France can play a larger role in Asian trade. Undoubtedly, the Dutch are still a powerful naval and commercial power, but they lose their specific competitive advantage, far closer to their competitors in power. While this could be a downgrade to pure Dutch strength, in return they are now a far more conventional great power, with a developed industrial base, a good navy and commercial ties, and a decent army, rather than hyper-focusing on just trade and the navy. While I would expect that the Dutch Golden Age is less dominant on the world stage, its historical crash into a second or third-rate power may well be prevented. Its population would be nearly doubled compared to our own timeline, still smaller than powers like Spain, Austria and France, but rather comparable to the Kingdom of England. Especially in the long term, the importance of the Dutch may very well be amplified. But from here, the scenarios becomes difficult to continue concretely. It really depends on a load of factors, like who ends up controlling the Spanish lowlands in the short and the long term. Do the Dutch align themselves with the enemies of France, or with France in hopes of further benefiting themselves? In reality, it is also important to note that early modern alliances were extremely flexible, especially since I am oversimplifying alternate centuries of history. More than likely, the Dutch simply find themselves rotating allies based on what benefits them the most, and which of the great powers presents the biggest threat at that particular moment. The conclusions to these alternate struggles for power are near infinite, ranging from the Dutch making the difference in containing the French, leading to a less Franco-centric early modern era, to the exact opposite, the Dutch allowing for an even more dominant France in the Low Countries, perhaps even allowing them to be a greater success elsewhere, if not continuing to push into Flanders as well. Of course, a boring but plausible answer is also that European geopolitics simply adapt to the new situation, and due to shifting alliances and wars, much like in our timeline, no decisive winner is found on the continent, but the main difference is simply that within this balance of power, the Dutch continue to play the role of a great power. Now, whatever the case, going into the farther future, by which point none of these maps are serious predictions to any extent, what we can be near certain about is that we have completely removed the concept of a Belgium. Even in scenarios where the Dutch state might completely collapse, France achieving a near full victory, the concept of unity amongst the Dutch speakers would be far more common. Protestantism would be far more present in Flanders and Brabant. Even if France takes over these territories, suggesting to these Flemish that they should be united with the Walloons in the south rather than with the Dutch in the north would make them look at you funny. In fact, Walloons would likely not even exist. If in any capacity the region falls under French control, the Walloons would meet the fate of any other French regional identity, slowly subsumed as French culture, language and law centralizes. If the region does fall into Dutch hands, the French speakers within the Netherlands would much more likely fight in order to be able to join the French nation than fight for some independent Walloon state. Now, interestingly, if this region does fall in some form to the French, this is actually a surprisingly big deal. Wallonia is rich in coal and iron, which would substantially increase French industrial potential and independence, as even in the entire worldwide French Empire, coal was so scarce that France up to World War I relied mostly on Germany for their coal supply. So, in many ways, this change to the Netherlands has the potential to change European geopolitics up significantly. But as for the specifics, I will leave them up to you. For now, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.